Duncan McNabb here, 10th of September 2024. Now, this weekend just past, Cancun has apparently been host to the Hells Angels International Gathering. Margaritas, mayhem, Mexican food, and highly likely to be discussing, outside of electronic eavesdropping, face-to-face meetings are always great for this, their international crime business. And that would include substantially drugs. It's no surprise that Cancun, whilst being a lovely place for a weekend, is also a stronghold of the Sinaloa cartel. These are the most dangerous, violent, and lucrative drug dealing cartel in the world. This cartel also has long-standing links with the Hells Angels in North America and in Australia. Now, one of the people due to be there that weekend didn't quite make it. His name is Angelo Pandelli. Mr. Pandelli is the Australian Hells Angels boss. He's been living in Dubai for the last couple of years, a sunny place for shady people, as I invariably mention. Mr. Pandelli didn't quite get on the plane to Mexico. Instead, on Thursday of last week, he was deported from the UAE, and we believe it was on a direct flight from Dubai to Sydney. Unfortunately, didn't stop off on the way so he could leave the plane, and he ended up back in Sydney. Now, the Australian Federal Police are being quite reticent to comment, perhaps, or careful, and they've noted that a 53-year-old Australian was deported from the UAE last week, but they're not going to comment any further. So there's a story at the moment for me is, where's Angelo? Is there a mystery involved, or has he just simply gone home and enjoying life back in Sydney? We just don't know. As soon as I find out, I will let you know. Now, I suppose a snapshot of who the Hells Angels are, because this is the world's most powerful gang, not necessarily the biggest gang, but certainly the most powerful gang. And it's been around for a lot of years. It's incredibly well established. It is a 1%er club. Now, that 1%er thing you see around the outlaw motorcycle gang dates back to 1947, a gathering of motorcycle enthusiasts from around the United States to just enjoy the weekend. It was in Hollister, California. It went from a convivial gathering to a complete and utter drunken shit fight. Windows broken, bars trashed. They drank the town out of beer. By the end of the weekend, there were about 60 people injured, and the American Motorcyclists Association, who had sponsored the event, were horrified at what had happened and blamed the melees on the, quote, 1% deviant that had turned up. Now, these 1% deviants, the outlaw motorcycle gangs, love that expression, and they've adopted it, and that's hence 1%er club. The Hells Angels formally started off about a year later in San Bernardino, California, same place, same year as the other well-known international franchise McDonald's started. In the early 1950s, the club had a very Hollywood feel to it, and that continued for a number of years. Sonny Barger, probably the definitive Hells Angel, and his mates went to see Marlon Brando in The Wild One in the early 1950s, and they were looking at Brando, sort of looking quite smouldering, lying on the seat of his bike, looking at the camera. But they also saw in the background Lee Marvin's character Chino, scruffy, dangerous, menacing, and they all decided that Chino was the bloke they were going to model themselves after, which gave the bikies that sort of raffish feel. In the early to mid-1960s, they were also very big in Hollywood as extras. If you wanted a couple of rough-looking blokes on bikes, the Hells Angels were happy to turn up and put a show on for you. Hunter S. Thompson, the famous American journalist, was embedded with them for a number of years, chronicling their exports, their outlaw lifestyle, their sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing. They loved it all. But it was rock and roll that sort of got them into a bit of strife shortly. One of the reasons I think the Hells Angels got into the drug business as strongly as they did was they needed money for lawyers. They were involved in a number of serious things, like not only drug crimes, but also sexual assaults en masse, which Hunter S. Thompson covered comprehensively. They had the skills to make drugs, and they had the market for it, LSD and amphetamines back in those days. The rock and roll component came in a couple of years later when, in 1969, the Rolling Stones were on their Let It Bleed tour, and they mistakenly hired the Hells Angels to assist with security and logistics. Now, the Hells Angels are great logistics managers, but on this day, they didn't do a great job. There was a blue in the crowd. A Hells Angel stabbed a person from the crowd. Bikes riding through the crowd turned into a complete and utter disaster, not unlike Hollister. Very messy, very dangerous, and very high profile. The Hells Angels' reputation of being sort of raffish clowns, nice, interesting rogues, was suddenly getting a little bit edgier. Throughout the 1970s, they became the target of the FBI for racketeering. Many of their senior management went to jail for drug trafficking and manufacture, and also for serious crimes, including murder. But this, an organisation like the Hells Angels is very robust, and that didn't really impede their progress. In the late 70s, they came to Australia, their first major international expansion. They hooked up with a local gang in Melbourne, and in return for providing that gang with their amphetamine recipe, that gang would provide them with the readily available precursor chemicals that were getting scarce in the United States. These are things you need to make amphetamines. The Australians kindly sent them across disguised as pineapple juice cans. Very smart, nice bit of business. That was pretty much the catalyst for the Australian amphetamine business, which boomed throughout the 1980s. The only problem the Hells Angels in Melbourne had was a fairly nosy police officer doing a great job closing down some of their meth labs. Their response was fairly definitive. They contacted the United States, who then sent out an assassin to kill the police officer. This is what the bike gangs know as knock for knock. Someone comes in, does the job and leaves. It's a favour earned, not paid for, just a favour in the favour bank. This bloke turned up. The police had been alerted that there might have been a problem, stopped at the airport. They open his suitcase. He's got things like knuckle dusters and press clippings of his prior crimes. The guy is not a criminal mastermind. He's turned around at the airport and says something witty like, "I suppose I shouldn't have come." Well, spot on, mate. That, again, didn't impede the Hells Angels or their other cohorts in the Australian outlaw motorcycle gang scene. Business starts booming. Throughout the 90s, business is booming. The Hells Angels, and I'm diving here for a piece of paper, the Hells Angels got themselves into a lot of strife back then as well. In the late 1990s, a gang that always prided itself on keeping below the radar through the 80s and early 90s, they got into strife. They had a major battle in Scandinavia and Northern Europe with the Bandidos, again over drug dealing, turf and all that sort of stuff. 11 people were killed, including a couple of members of the public. One died in a rocket-propelled grenade attack by the Bandidos on a Hells Angels clubhouse where they were just having a social function for the neighbours. There are also 74 attempted killings and 96 people injured. Around about the same time, and this is the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was also a battle in the United States, in Canada, in Quebec. Now, the Hells Angels had sided with the Rizzuto mafia family. Mafia fanciers will know that there are 5 families of New York. Rizzuto's always called themselves the 6th, a seriously evil bit of kit. The Hells Angels and their mates, the Rizzutos, were again fighting in Quebec for dominance in the drug trafficking trade and also firearms. They were battling a mob called the Alliance, which are a couple of ne'er-do-well local gangs and so on. This war ran for a couple of years and it left 162 people dead, 130 cases of arson and 84 bombings. One of those bombings killed a poor kid who was just simply riding his bike home from school that afternoon. So the Hells Angels have this strong and violent past. Forget what you hear about charity runs and movie businesses I mentioned earlier. The Hells Angels are the world's dominant gang. They are the most powerful gang, and I would suspect probably the most dangerous. But removing people like Angelo Pandelli doesn't stop them. They have, like any good business, succession planning. So there might be a couple of momentary problems with them, but they will get on with the business of selling drugs. And if you happen to be in Australia, we have a massive drug market, considering our small size. It is probably the most lucrative drug market in the world outside a couple of the UAE-style countries. So with that, thank you, and I'll be back later, particularly if we find Angelo Pandelli. Thanks.